Good evening, welcome. For just a few minutes. Welcome to our event tonight. While you wait for us to get started, we have a quick poll for everyone to fill out. So a few questions for you to tell us about yourselves, how you identify, where you're joining us from, if you've previously attended the Flatbush House Museum, and one thing you can't live without. You can take a second to answer those questions in the poll. You can also put them in the chat as well. Look forward to getting started in just a few minutes. Got some response already, which is awesome. Another welcome to everyone who's joined. We have a poll right now asking some questions about yourself. So what brings you to the program? If you previously attended the program before, and what is one thing that you cannot live without? At the top of mind, it would be music and my headphones. Really quick answer. We'll get started in just a few minutes. All right, I think we'll give it about two more minutes. I see we do have some newcomers to a program with the Flatbush House Museum, so welcome again. If you've previously attended this program before, or any one of our other in-person virtual programs, right? I think we can go ahead and get started. I will end the poll. 1 second. Share. Okay. All right. Okay. Welcome again. My name is Adriana Perkins. I am the Education Manager here at the Flatbush House Museum. I am joined by Brian Yan, our Executive Director. I'm also joined by Shauna Sabio and Daphne Lundy, our panelists for the evening. Tonight, we will dive into an engaging discussion on the rich history of the Flatbush African Burial Ground. Located at the intersection of Bedford and Church Avenues in the heart of Flatbush, the sacred space served as a final resting place for enslaved and free Black individuals in Brooklyn from the mid-1600s to the mid-1800s. Together, we'll explore the trauma-infused strategies to preserve Black history by placing it within the broader context of national and global narratives using the Flatbush African Burial Ground as an example. Black Historic Sites in Conversation is a series of virtual talks in collaboration with different Black heritage sites, cultural centers, and others in the greater NYC area about the ongoing work of preserving, interpreting, and celebrating Black history and historical figures. This program is supported by the Mellon Foundation. I would like to acknowledge that the House Museum, the Flatbush House Museum, is located in Flushing, Queens, and is on the land of the Matinecock, who are the Algonquin people. They are the Aboriginal occupants of Northwestern Long Island. Among the first to feel the impact of European settlement, they seldom are mentioned after the colonial period. The Matinecock experienced profound changes after the 17th century. To learn more about the Matinecock Nation, we invite you to visit their website and their Facebook page, and I'll put those links into the chat now. Moving on, we're also going to talk a little bit about Lewis Latimer. So if you aren't familiar about his story, Lewis Howard Latimer was born on September 4th, 1848 in Chelsea, Massachusetts, to Virginians Rebecca and George Latimer, whose self-emancipation sparked abolition movements in Boston. Latimer served his country enlisting in the Union Navy at the age of 16 in 1864, during which he taught himself how to draw. He became a chief draftsman, a patent expert, and an inventor. He worked with Hiram Maxim, Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Edison, and he supervised lighting systems in New York, Canada, and London. And of the 7 patents he received, his improvements to the incandescent light bulb made lighting more practical and affordable. He was also a creative, a musician, a poet, a multilingualist, and an artist. And as a Black man living and working during the late 1800s and the early 1900s, his story and impact drive the work and mission of the Lewis Latimer House Museum today. Our speakers for tonight, our first speaker will be Shauna Savio. She is a proud mother of 3, born in Brownsville and raised in Bushwick and Bed-Stuy. She is a multidisciplinary artist, a curator, a cultural strategist, and a plug historian whose practice uses the intersections of art and technology, travel, and urban planning to create healing, anti-racist, equitable, and inclusive spaces. She is the co-founder and co-director of Grow House NYC, a community development cooperative that empowers Black people and their allies to collectively own and develop their community's resources, including cultural property, cultural institutions, sites of memory, and artistic production. Grow House was a founding organization of the Flatbush African Burial Ground Coalition and has used walking tours, art installations, technology partnerships, events, teach-ins, and partnerships with colleges and universities to raise awareness of the Flatbush African Burial Ground. Our facilitator tonight is Daphne Lundy. She is an urban planner, policymaker, writer, and artist. She is currently a public scholar at the Moynihan Center at City College, where her writing and teaching explores the intersections between science fiction and city planning. She is also the co-creator of the Lundy Collab, an inaugural Bandung resident. She is a founding member and board member of Black Space, a collective of Black urbanists who work to bridge the gaps between policy, people, and place to address inequality and injustice in the built environment. She also serves as an advisory board member and visiting teacher for the Octavia Project, a science fiction summer program for teen girls and non-binary youth that uses the lens of science fiction to explore computer science, writing, and city making. So tonight we're going to hear a presentation by Shauna, followed up with a conversation between Shauna and Daphne, along with a Q&A session. So if you have any questions that you want the panelists to answer, you can put them in the Q&A function. We'll likely be able to get to about 10 questions if we have them, depending on the time. You can also comment and add questions in the chat if that's easier as well. So without further ado, I pass it to you, Shauna.
Thank you. Listening to Lewis Latimer's biography, I'm just so moved by his skill, his expertise, and he's an inspiration. So thank you so much for sharing that history. I didn't know that much about that. Okay, so the title of my presentation is History as Healing. And throughout the presentation, I'm going to ask us to pause and take some breaths as part of a trauma-informed practice. I know some of the history that we'll be going over can be traumatic for some and painful. However, I'm hoping that together we can build some emotional resilience and get through it together, and also mine the history for some lessons and some gems that we can use day to day. So I wanted to just kind of get a quick check-in in the chat. If you want to enter your name and the neighborhood that you live in. I'm currently located in Crown Heights. My name is Shauna Savio. My pronouns are she and her. And Crown Heights actually sits on Lenape ancestral homeland. So I want to acknowledge the Lenape people, much like Lewis Latimer House Museum sits on the Matinecock ancestral homeland. I want to acknowledge that this land was stolen and coerced from its original inhabitants, who now currently reside not only in New York, but also in Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and parts of Canada. All right, let me see what's going on in the chat. I can't see it yet. Let's continue. Okay, so what are my intentions for the talk? I want to share a brief history of the Flatbush African Burial Ground. I'll try to be as brief as I possibly can. I get pretty passionate about this history and can go pretty in depth, but I'll try to keep it brief. And then I also want to make the case that history is crucial to imagining equitable futures. Um, and I also want to share opportunities for you to get involved with the Flatbush African Burial Ground Coalition, as well as my organization, Grow House. All right, so we'll start with our first breath. I invite folks to either close their eyes and just take a time to breathe in through your nose, hold it at the top, and breathe out through your mouth. And continue to do that. In through your nose, hold at the top, breathe out through your mouth. In through your nose, hold at the top, and breathe out through your mouth. You can rest here for a minute, and as you rest, I just want to share why I'm doing this. I really believe that in our society, part of the reasons why we are where we are, in terms of trying to ban DEI, also eliminating affirmative action, is because we haven't been taught emotional literacy and how to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. A lot of the history of our society is uncomfortable. It's histories of trauma, histories of pain, but also histories of triumph. And I'm hoping that tonight we'll be able to do some of that work together. So throughout the presentation, there will be these moments, these breath breaks, and I might invite you to share in the chat how you're feeling, or you can do that at will as you feel. All right, so about Grow House, I don't feel like I need to reiterate what Adriana so beautifully put together for us. Our vision, though, is for Black communities to be sovereign, connected, and thriving. And the way that we've been working to do that is by helping communities to cooperatively organize, finance, occupy, and steward real estate, land, and other forms of wealth. The Flatbush African Burial Ground and its history being one form of wealth that I would love for us to cooperatively steward together. A little bit more about the practice. As you notice in the upper left-hand corner, we used art, namely the fence weaving, as part of the Global Fence Weaving Project to mark the African Burial Ground. We used technology partnerships with Kinfolk to create an augmented reality monument of one of the key figures, who you'll see in the middle. His name is Sam Anderson, who is a pivotal figure for the Flatbush African Burial Ground and Weeksville as well. And it was a really beautiful experience. You'll see some images of our walking tours and our events in contemplation of freedom. And on the lower right was a workshop that was done in conjunction with Ifoma Ebo of Spitzer School of Architecture with her students, where we transformed a block in Flatbush into a history and heritage corridor. Our goal in the next 2 years is to be able to collectively own 3 to 6 properties in central Brooklyn as an anti-gentrification strategy. All right, so why is this so important to Grow House if we're really about building community wealth? And as I mentioned, you know, DEI is being banned in our society in certain areas of our country. And I don't know how many of you got a chance to read The Colorblind List Trap by Nicole Hannah-Jones, which was in the New York Times Magazine. She makes a really strong and compelling case that over the past 50 years, there's been a concerted effort to undo the gains of the civil rights era. And I believe that it's going to be really important for us all, whether we're in academia or not, to be grounded in our collective history and to be able to stand in it from a place of power and truth. To that end, I just wanted us to sit with these 3 numbers. I've heard many times in talking about slavery and the history of enslavement, oh, well, why do we care about this? This was so long ago. And when you look at these 3 numbers, the one on the left being $3 billion was the value that was assigned to enslaved Africans in 1860. This was an estimate. Then on the top right corner, 300 pounds was the daily capacity of the Havamaya sugar refinery in Brooklyn. And then on the bottom is 100, which is the amount of years that it would take to close the racial wealth gap. These three in numbers like are really important because I think oftentimes when people come to a place like New York, which is culturally diverse, many people from the African diaspora living here, they don't see enslavement as a part of all of our history. But if you look at the Havamaya sugar refinery, that sugar was grown in the Caribbean and transported here to the United States to be manufactured and distilled. And so there's a definite connection to Caribbean history and an even deeper one, which I hope we can get into a little later in the presentation. Also, in terms of the racial wealth gap, you know, we need to talk about reparations. Sandy Darity, who is a known scholar in the field of reparations, had this quote, which I think is really appropriate as we talk about community land and community wealth building, which is namely that we can't really financial literacy our way out of the racial wealth gap. There have to be structural examinations of how we got to where we are. And I believe that history is one of those tools that we can use to learn the lessons of the past and inform a reparations policy for our future. All right, first breath break. I want folks to share in the chat, how are you feeling so far? Just thinking about that emotion wheel. How are you feeling? Just drop it in the chat and I'll take a look. Nice to see some familiar faces. Hello, Miss Rennie. Okay. How are folks feeling? And Robert from the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, so nice to see you here. I'm glad you could make it. Wonderful. Critical, Ari says. Fine. Activated. Great, Sherry says. For folks feeling activated, that could mean either, you know, stressed, energized, whatever it is. I invite you to take a moment to breathe. Anxiousness, empowered. Okay, great. Thank you for sharing. A bit agitated. Okay. Thanks for sharing. So another chat check-in. One of my favorite people in the world, Dr. Melba Sullivan, is a psychologist who lives right here in Brooklyn. And her favorite saying is there's wisdom in every seat. So I know that we tend to have a very knowledgeable crowd at these workshops. I've heard from Rand. So I want to know what folks know about enslavement in New York, specifically in the chat. And I hope that I'll cover some things that you don't already know and maybe reinforce some things that you do. Overwhelmed a bit. Great, cared, love for. Someone says barely anything. Okay, hopefully you'll walk away with something that you can share. New York City was once one of the largest slave markets in the Americas. Beautiful. Keep the answers coming in. All right. So Flatbush, where the Flatbush African Burial Ground is located, really sits squarely in the middle of several indigenous paths, which I think is really important to note. And it was one of the reasons why the Dutch decided to settle along Flatbush Avenue specifically, because there were already well-worn paths and shaping that was done by the indigenous Lenape people who were here. As I mentioned, the Lenape people were coerced and often forced off of their land. On the right-hand side is a map of their territory, some of which intersected with other tribes from the north or peoples from the north. And I won't go over that again, but please take a look at this slide and I hope I can share it with you later. All right, timeline of slavery in New York. So slavery really begins in earnest in 1626 in New York, when 16 enslaved Africans are brought to New Amsterdam, some of whom bear the name of their points of origin. So we have people like Peter Sao Tome, who came from Sao Tome. We have Paul de Angola, who came from Angola. So there are a lot of markers that people carried with them of their origins. In 1644, the Dutch mount a war, really a massacre against the Lenape people, but against tremendous resistance from one particular person called Penowitz, who was an indigenous chief of the Canarsie tribe right here in Brooklyn, who gathered 300 soldiers from his people and fought valiantly, but inevitably lost their land and were coerced into signing treaties. And then in 1655, the Whitpard was a ship that brought 300 enslaved Africans to New Amsterdam. This was one of the first large-scale importations, if you want to call it, of enslaved people to what is now known as New York. I love to note that there were three uprisings in New York. 1702 uprising isn't as well known as the 1712 and 1741 uprisings, but for me, they really marked that enslaved people always had a sense of agency and resisted their enslavement. And then the last thing that I'll touch on this slide is the Haitian Revolution. And I like to bring this up because Flatbush is situated in a community with a large Haitian population. And I think it's really eye-opening for people of Haitian descent who attend the tour, the walking tour that I do, when they recognize that the Haitian Revolution reverberated here in New York. There are actually articles that are written in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle and some other New York newspapers that recount experiences of white people who fled Haiti during the revolution and shared their experiences. So I think it's really important to share that piece. So where is the burial ground? On this 1855 map, it shows a perimeter of the burial ground, but we believe that it extends even further than that, namely because over the many years of buildings being placed in the space, the sewers being built, the streets being built, there were ancestral remains that were found. This is an aerial view that was taken by Daquan Collier, who's a videographer of what is left of the Flatbush African Burial Ground that is uncovered. And as I mentioned, there were multiple times during which ancestral remains were found, one of which was noted in a 1904 newspaper where school children basically carried away teeth and bones as souvenirs. And it was evident that this was the bones of an enslaved African person here in Brooklyn. I'm going to take a pause here and just share a little bit about African presence in Flatbush. So the numbers are really staggering. These are numbers that I did not learn in school. So about 70 to 80% of all Flatbush families in 1800 had at least one enslaved person. Some of the largest slaveholders had around 16. Hendrik Eilat was one of them. And you'll see on the right pictures of the Lefferts House, which now sits in Prospect Park, from its original location in Maple Street in Flatbush, and the Hendrik Eilat House, which is in Flatlands. Second important point to note is that Kings County had the highest concentration of slaves north of the Mason-Dixon line at the beginning of the American Revolution. So that's around 1776. And then according to the first federal census in 1790, 1/3 of the total population of Kings County were enslaved. So where did these enslaved people come from? Interesting enough, there was a significant Caribbean exchange and inter-American slave trade. So these are some figures that capture from the 1600s actually to the 1800s, where it shows that the second largest population of enslaved people came from Jamaica, with the first one being an amalgamation of various ports. The way that it's recorded in slavevoyages.org, which is a database of slave ships, it just basically says unspecified African ports. But if you parse that out, there are major areas where enslaved people came from. Madagascar was also a significant contributor to the slave trade here, which is an interesting fact that I don't think a lot of people know. And then we have South Carolina as an evidence of the inter-American slave trade. So I wanted to show this slide because I wanted us to get a sense of where people were coming from. This is one year, 1751, who they were going to. And some of these names you'll recognize as street names, such as Livingston, Reed, Stuyvesant, Beekman, um, Ludlow. These are all street names that are named after enslavers. The same pattern is seen in Flatbush as well. This map, as you see here, is along Flatbush Avenue, and it's based on the 1755 census, as well as a map that was in a book that I read from 1790. And it basically outlines some locations of homesteads where enslaved people were. And if you notice, the highlighted names are names of streets, not only in Flatbush, but also in East New York, in the Bronx as well. And underneath are the names of enslaved people as listed on the 1755 slave census, over 15 years old. Um, it's likely that most of these people are interred at the Flatbush African Burial Ground, which you can see is not too far from where those traditional homesteads would have been. Here's a picture of some sites of enslavement. On the left-hand side is the housing for Hendrik I. Lot's enslaved people in Flatlands, rather. And on the right, you'll notice it's kind of a reenactment or a staging of what that kind of housing would have looked like during the period of enslavement. And the reason why I think it's interesting, I'll go back up to this slide. One of the major differences between enslavement in the North and enslavement in the South were the numbers of enslaved, even though the concentration was pretty high. If you notice, enslaved people were living in close proximity to their enslavers, which is why when evidence of insurrections or plots came up, they were treated with a lot more vitriol than you would expect. And so self-emancipation was very common. It was one form of resistance, but there were multiple forms of resistance in the form of poisonings, work stoppages, um, work slowing down work, etc. So the way that enslavement worked in the North is that in 1799, the Gradual Emancipation Act was passed, and that act basically had the stipulation that enslaved people who were born after a certain period would have to continue to work and would be gradually emancipated. So the final end of slavery was listed as 1827 in New York. However, even though there wasn't slavery in New York, the economy was still driven by slave goods. If you notice on the left, there's a table of sugar that left the port of New York, and this was in 1863, well after the abolition of enslavement in the North. But New York was still making great amounts of money, not only in transporting slave made goods, but in the financing of slave ships, insuring enslaved people, storing. So a lot of the warehouses that we see in Brooklyn may have been storehouses for slave made goods. Okay, so one of my slides did not show. Um, okay, we'll skip that one. This slide shows the banks that were created by slaveholding families. And once again, you'll see names that are very familiar if you've walked the streets of New York, such as Bergen, Debevoise, Chauncey, Covert, etc. And so part of what I hope to do during the walks that I give is share individual stories, because my main beef with the way that slavery has been portrayed or shared has been just nameless, faceless people. And so these are some examples of the people that I feature in the walk that I do in Flatbush. All right, I'm going to pause here for a moment and hope that I still have enough time to go through the remainder of the slides and just check the chat. How are folks feeling? My grandmother lives on one of the streets named after one of those folks on the last slide. Wow. Okay. Grew up on Stuyvesant Avenue. Yes. Thanks, Deborah, for sharing. All right. Wonderful. Okay. So not to beat a dead horse, but why is this history important? Research has shown that, people, specifically young people who feel connected to their cultural history, do better across all measures. And I think it has something to say with instilling a sense of pride. During some of the walks that I've given for young people, I've noticed in the beginning of the tour, they tend to feel a little bit ashamed or reticent about the stories of enslavement. But as we progress, I feel like there is a sense of pride that's instilled. The second point that I really want to highlight is that sacred sites like the Flatbush African Burial Ground are a great place to build community resilience and this comfort with being uncomfortable. Um, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, part of the reason why DEI is being banned is because people don't want their children to feel uncomfortable. But we can't always be comfortable in life. And finally, public space can be a place where change can happen both individually and collectively. All right. This is kind of a way for me to collect information. If anyone is representing an African burial ground in New York or somewhere else, please share in the chat, or if you know of other African burial grounds, we really are trying to connect and share some of our struggles as well as information with each other. So please populate the chat with that information. All right, now we get to the futures part. Um, so some issues with my slides loading. Okay, let's see. Oh, I wanted to share here that, part of the reason why the Flatbush African Burial Ground is really pivotal for our organization, Grow House, and why we decided to keep staying invested in it is it's an example of how intentional communities can build wealth together. Namely, because Sam Anderson, who I showed in one of the earlier slides, right out of enslavement becomes one of the initial investors in Wheatsville. And he does it intentionally, and he does it using a method which I'm calling the Wheatsville method, where they bought lots of land from former enslavers who were looking to liquidate these assets and make money off of land as opposed to bodies. And what Black people did was purchase a bunch of that property and then divvied it up and put newspaper ads specifically in Black serving newspapers for people to buy the land at little to no cost. And the reason why they did that was because they understood that having land was one way that Black people could vote. There was an asset limit or floor that was placed on Black voters, namely $250 in assets. And having land that was appreciating in a rapidly, I don't want to call it gentrifying, but changing and shifting economy was one way that Black people could be able to vote during that time. And the other example that I wanted to point to was East New York CLT, who was just able to purchase land from a landlord. And that is the same model that Grow House is using. And we are actually in coalition with East New York CLT, among other CLTs in NICELY, which is New York City Community Land Initiative. Our goal is to really create a cultural and economic ecosystem for Black people in Brooklyn to prevent displacement by collectively owning a few properties that are listed here. And anchoring that property would be a grow house, which would be a space where people could come and relax after our tours. It would have short-term studios and spaces for people to stay, and really as a way for the community to continue to build our creativity and resilience in the midst of gentrification. It's just some images of some programs that we've done in the past that would be housed within that grow house. So now, what are we doing at the Flatbush African Burial Ground coming up? Our main goals are really going to be to build out the Flatbush African Burial Ground Coalition. We've been on hiatus for a little bit just to kind of rest and regroup after a very frantic and hectic season. And so we've partnered with Creative Urban Alchemy, as well as received a grant from the local center under Urban Design Forum to create some art at the Flatbush African Burial Ground. This is the design team that we're working with, led by Ifoma Ebo, and she's coalesced a great team for us to use to activate this public space. So part of what we're planning on doing, and we hope this actually is able to happen, is to create a temporary art installation, much like you see here. This was co-created with community, with input from our community. And what you're seeing are gabion walls that could be filled with oyster shells. It's a space where the community can come and learn about a permanent memorial at the Flatbush African Burial Ground, about history, come and reflect, share with one another, perform ancestral libations and such. And this would last for a year. It's not a permanent memorial, it's a temporary art installation. And these are some other mock-ups of the installation and what it could look like with some shelter from the elements. The other thing that we're in the midst of doing is a youth design competition. I don't know if you can recall that corridor that I showed with the turtles along it and the names of enslaved people in the homesteads where they were enslaved. Well, we've commissioned art from young people throughout Brooklyn, and we're going to be placing them on placards along that route to illustrate the history and potential future of Flatbush. And these are some of the submissions that we received from young artists, both in Brooklyn and in Queens. And we'll be selecting a few of those artists, and they will be mounted on signs that look very much like this along Flatbush Avenue and Church Avenue. This is some of the location. And so I'm coming to the conclusion of my talk, and I hope that you choose to get involved. We're going to have some really exciting volunteer opportunities coming up, some walks that we're going to be doing. And, you know, these are some of the themes that we're looking to explore with our volunteers. And, you know, we hope that you can bring your knowledge and expertise and share with us. And then these are two walks that are coming up. The one in Bed-Stuy is going to be really focused on indigenous flora and fauna. And the Flatbush walk would be one of the more history-focused walks. So with that, I'll close with this quote from James Baldwin. History is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. Wise man. All right, thank you so much for listening. And I'll check the chat really quickly to see. Okay. Great.
Thank you so much, Shauna. That was such a rich, beautiful presentation. And I feel like anytime I hear you talk about the burial ground, I keep learning new things and surfacing new things. So I really appreciate that. Um, there's so much for us to talk about, but I do have a couple of questions that come to mind, and then excited to hear what folks have to say in the chat. So you kind of started talking about this, how your approach to this project is really rooted in an understanding of Flatbush and the community that surrounds it. And it's been a really a longstanding Caribbean neighborhood for quite some time. And so I'm wondering how the Afro-Caribbean history informed, how you approach the site, informs how you interact with people. Like, how has that sort of history and cultural connection shaped the work?
Yeah, I think it started out really personally because I am of Caribbean descent, first generation American. And unfortunately, one of the things that I heard growing up was some really negative stereotypes about people of African descent here in America. And I think that there has always, not has always been, yeah, for a while, there's been this divide, right, between new immigrants and people who have been here for many generations. And so I think it's really important to appeal to people's self-interest in a way. And so I felt really, really thrilled and surprised when I learned that Caribbean history was as deep as it was in the United States, mainly through the inter-American slave trade. And I've seen when I bring this up um, on walks, people of Caribbean descent, their whole demeanor changes because then it's almost a very tangible way of showing that we all are connected, whether or not you were dropped off in the Caribbean, as you know, much as people hear this, you were dropped off in Jamaica, you were dropped off here in the United States. You never know if we are related. And on top of that, even if we aren't related, our historic struggles are really intertwined when you think about the finances of it, right? Where goods from enslaved labor in sugar rich or sugar heavy places like Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Barbados were brought to the United States to be manufactured and processed and then shipped off to Europe to enrich people there. So if we're going to talk about reparations, we have to really think about it not only from a local standpoint, but from a global standpoint. And that means that we have to begin to share with one another and explore with one another. So it definitely informed the way that I've been approaching the work. Flatbush is Little Caribbean. The burial ground is in the middle of Little Caribbean. And it also is a home to lots of people who aren't of African descent as well. And so it's important to have that history front and center.
Yeah, and I know that through the walks, it's been a really gentle way of inviting people to learn about the space, regardless of sort of familiarity or like cultural connection. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about how the relationship between the site and the neighborhood has evolved as you started doing your work.
Yeah, it's been interesting. So first, it was just blank, right? And it was also a trash dumping ground. There are two bus stops that are right there at that intersection. And I would often just see people take a drink and throw it over the fence. And it's like, wow, because there was no markers there to say that this is a sacred space. Then when the markers started to go up, they actually almost became a point of contention because it was some of the responses that we received was, well, I'm not African. That was one response that I got from Black people. So what does that have to do with me? Another response was, we don't really know if Black people are there. That was another response. Another response was a little more violent, and it was from, someone who is a vendor at the site and didn't appreciate seeing women being very vocally in leadership of a coalition. That was one thing. So, yeah, the relationship has been somewhat fraught, but I really do see it as trauma responses. In some ways, the site holds a lot of trauma. The history holds a lot of trauma. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to bring in trained professionals to help people work through their emotions as this painful history is.
Just checking our chat because it's really busy right now, which is exciting. I see one person has a question about the New York State Reparations Coalition and whether or not you're connected to them in some way or this work is connected to them in some way.
I would love to have this work connected to that work. And I'm hoping that over the summer, as we start to build out the coalition and the capacity of the coalition, that someone would be willing to take that on and be a liaison between the Flatbush African Burial Ground and the Reparations Committee for sure.
One more from the chat. There's somebody asking about learning about the genealogical history of the site. I think probably the most prominent example is what happened with the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan and how there was sort of DNA testing and sort of analysis done. Do you imagine something similar happening for this site, or is there any sort of discussion about that in the future?
Yeah, so the coalition actually received a grant to do ground penetrating radar at the burial ground. That's not going to necessarily allow us to do testing on DNA, but it will allow us to see how many burial plots were in use at the time. And the other thing that we're really trying to level set, or we're hoping to level set when that begins, which we're estimating is around Juneteenth, we're really going to begin doing that work. We want to level set that even if there aren't any remaining remains found, this is still a sacred site because we do have the history of the various desecrations that happened over time. So the site has been disturbed many times, and so it's likely that we may find, ancestral remains, or we may not. Either way, we're holding that it is a sacred site that requires some sort of memorialization and honor.
Could you talk?
Hmm. Okay.
Could you talk about any misconceptions or confusions that people have about the site, or like any things that could be illuminated that may not just be known about it?
About the site itself, there are a couple of things that I'm intrigued by. One is the potential that there may be indigenous remains um, at that site. Through anecdotal evidence, wherever there is a Dutch Reformed church, there tends to be an African burial ground nearby or an indigenous burial ground nearby. And so I think it's going to be interesting to try to build a solidarity between indigenous and Mape people who are looking to, be involved with restewarding their land again and this particular space. That's one thing. Another thing that I think is really interesting about the site that people don't recognize is the fact that resistance was so common. I feel like people think of, when they think of slave uprisings, they do think of the Haitian Revolution. They think of, oh my goodness, why am I blanking on it? Denmark. Let's see. They have like certain names that they know of, but they don't really think about how resistance happened every day and in really subtle and overt ways. So I think it's always interesting to illuminate that. And yeah, that's all I have for right now in terms of things I think people need to understand.
There's a really beautiful question around the idea of community resilience. And, especially with this work, you're working with young people, you're working with people who may be new to this. How are you able to navigate those feelings of despair and just like uncertainty with the work in how you approach it?
Yeah, I mean, I think where I'm going is really around having active stewardship of spaces because with the way that Black people and Brown people are being moved around, displaced, um, I'm hoping to build a bridge between legacy residents and newcomers through these walks, and then also pair the relationship building with actual tangible assets and spaces that we can collectively steward together. Because I think oftentimes we can get into this planning fatigue where we're thinking about things, dreaming about things, speculating about futures, but that tangible place that you can go to is going to be even more crucial as we go into these trying times, with the way that the political climate is nationally. We're going to need safe spaces that we can work together to collectively steward. So that's where I'm focusing my energy to combat the despair. And I see the Flatbush African Burial Ground almost as a practice. And like, how do we make decisions together? How do we navigate conflict together? How do we heal one another? How do we have difficult conversations? Those are all the parts, the practices that I think despair. Thank you for asking that question. I'm also going to reflect on it even more deeply.
I have one question that came to mind just in hearing you talk, and uh, it, it's about how we might think about uh, care for the dead, care for the people that have passed away. I think even in the presentation you gave us, you created the space for us to pause and breathe and reflect. And I'm wondering how you think about that type of care for people who are no longer with us, who have maybe were forgotten, were erased. Like, how do we think about that Yeah, in the past life. And I'm also just bringing in the fact that so many Caribbean traditions have a relationship with the dead. They're never gone. I'm also just thinking about that from like a Haitian context, like they are always with us. So how do you sort of navigate that in your work?
Um, it's interesting because when I do the walk, there are moments where it feels like a very spiritual experience. And when I go home, I'm white. And I really believe it's because of the energy that the space holds. And so last November, we did a form of ritual that's known throughout the Caribbean called Nine Nights. It wasn't exactly a Nine Nights, which is really more celebratory, dancing, drinking. We had some parameters because we were at the burial ground. We had to close up at a certain time. But I felt like it was a really healing time to think about and disrupt some of the ways that we think about time in our society. Um, in African and indigenous societies all around the world, they don't see time as linear. They see it as cyclical. And part of that cycle does include ancestors who are always around, nature spirits who have been witnesses to many eons of human history. So it's really a beautiful potentiality for the African burial ground to be one of those portals, I like to say, where people can sit in that Dekenga pavilion and contemplate time differently, even as we're being forced to squeeze a lot into a little bit of time. How do we make those moments where we can pause and reflect about the trajectory of our lives, even like where are we going, why are we doing what we're doing, where do we sit in the legacy and lineage of our ancestors, in this long pathway, long through line of history. And it's, yeah, it has a really great potential to be a space for that.
I also saw there was one question in the chat about books or readings that you'd recommend to folks who want to just get better connected to this history.
Yeah, there are a few of them, so I'll type them in the chat after I say them. One is of cabbages in Kings County. It's really more about the agricultural history of Kings County specifically, and they do have some parts about enslavement. And I'll pull the author and put it in the chat. Another one is Root and Branch, which is really a history of New York and New Jersey enslavement, from 1600s through the 1800s. And another is The Covenant with Color by Craig Wilder, who goes through, another expansive history of enslavement here. And for the trauma piece, I really loved, My Grandmother's Hands by Resma Menakem. He really talks about, he's a psychologist and an author, but he goes through the way that trauma and racialized trauma specifically shows up in our interactions and is passed between people and ways to disrupt, um, that kind of trauma response. Let me put those in the chat now.
I know we're coming to the end, which is very wild because I feel like there's so many other places for us to go with this. But how can folks get involved or stay involved with the work that you're doing and the work that's happening at the burial ground?
Yeah, I would say, follow both on Instagram. So Grow House is at Grow House BK on Instagram, and the Flatbush African Burial Ground Coalition is at FabG Coalition. Um, Both of those are on Instagram. And through those Instagrams, you'll be able to get links to our website and any events that are coming up. So that's a great way to get started and get connected and plugged in. And I'm really excited for the ground penetrating radar because we're hoping to make it a community event where residents and people, from around the borough can come and lay out the lines for the ground penetrating radar, learn about it. Once it's done, come back and help interpret the data, So it's going to be a really promising time and interesting conversation. And then the other thing is before that, we're going to be putting up some new signage and we're going to do it in a crowdsourced way. So I know we got a lot of history nerds in the audience. Come out and flex your history. And we'll workshop what is going to be the new iteration of signage at the Flatbush African Burial Ground. So just stay tuned on the Instagram pages. And I'm pulling those links out.
I see we have maybe one more question we can fill in. I see a question from Theta about the descendants of people that were interred in the burial ground and if there are any sort of connections to those families.
Yeah, we actually have one connection named Sandra Bell. Is that her name? Sandra, yeah, Sandra Bell, who is a descendant or married to a descendant of Sam Anderson. Um, And so I'm hoping that we can begin to bring more, directly descended people into the conversation, especially using the census. We're also partnering really deeply with Lefferts House and the Reimagine Lefferts initiative. And, there are amazing scholars there, namely Dylan Yates and Raya Kinsey, who are doing amazing work in unearthing and parsing through records. And so bringing people into that, and hopefully folks will be able to get the connection and maybe recognize a connection that they have to the space. So yeah. Sorry, I'm not doing a good job at multitasking.
No, it's okay. Your job is to share this wealth of knowledge. I think that's it for questions in the chat. Yeah, I think that might have been the last one. And when I see some people sharing some really great resources as well.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, we have 2 minutes left. Just make sure everyone can see me as well. Perfect, perfect. I'm like hiding myself and I can't turn back on. Anyway, this has been amazing. I'm so excited to go back through this and to hear the conversations again. There has been so much happening in the chat. It's amazing. We will definitely follow up with the links and resources that everyone shared. Thank you for your participation, just in terms of attending the program, but also just kind of letting us know where you're coming from, what your connections are to these different grounds, what you've read, you personally, what you've written yourself. This is amazing. In the last minute or so, let us know in the chat if there are any other Black historical sites that you would like the Lewis Latimer House to feature or include for another Black historic sites and conversation series. Please let us know. We definitely want to make sure that we are really addressing and featuring those sites that you really want to learn about or are part of, or they're in your community in some way. Got a few. Perfect. Maryland Historical Trust. Okay. Oh, that's a resource. Okay, perfect. Um, thank you, Shauna. Thank you, Daphne. Fantastic job with the presentation and your conversations. Yeah, I think that's it for me, Rand, unless you have anything else. Thank you all for joining. Please definitely keep an eye out for current events happening with the Latimer House as well. I'm dropping in a link to our newsletter. I'll also put a link to the website as well. We are reopening very, very soon, which we're super excited about. So stay tuned for official updates on our reopening as well and summer events. Thank you again. Thank you again, guys.
Thank you.
You.
Bye.